Hello, and welcome to China Forum, the leading program for discussing the latest in trends and development in modern Chinese culture, politics, economics, and social issues. My name is Madeline Federley, and I will be your moderator for our program today. Today, on China Forum, we will be discussing the evolution of the U.S.-China relationship, and we are happy to welcome today's expert, Dr. Richard Solomon. Dr. Richard Solomon is currently a senior fellow at the RAND Corporation. Prior to joining RAND, Dr. Solomon served as president of the U.S.Institute of Peace from 1993 to 2012. From 1989 to 1992, Dr. Solomon was Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, during which time he negotiated the Cambodia Peace Agreement, working closely with the Chinese and other members of the UN Security Council. Before this, from 1971 to 1976, he served on the National Security Council, where he worked with President Richard Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger on the normalization of relations with China. In 1995, Dr. Solomon joined the State Department awarded Dr. Solomon the Foreign Affairs Award for Public Service. Additionally, he has received awards for policy initiatives from the governments of Korea and Thailand, and in 2005 he received the American Political Science Association's Hubert H. Humphrey Career Award for notable public service by a political scientist. Dr. Solomon, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Quite an impressive bio. So for our first question, you have had a very illustrious and impressive career, as we just talked about. You began your career in 1966 as a professor at the University of Michigan.
Right.
You left Michigan in 1971 to become a staff member on the United States National Security Council, responsible for Asian affairs, when in this position you worked with the NSC advisor, Dr. Henry Kissinger, on the normalizations with relations with China.
Right.
So to begin our conversation, can you reflect a little bit about what it was like to work at the NSC at such a crucial and historically significant period with U.S.-China relations?
Well, I guess the most concise thing to say, it was an enormously exciting, thrilling opportunity that I had not anticipated. Because I had spent well over a decade learning Chinese language, living in Taiwan and Hong Kong, doing research of an academic sort, and it was a very disturbing time in terms of what was going on in China. This was the height of the Cultural Revolution, and their politics seemed to be in turmoil. There was tremendous hostility towards the United States, American imperialism as they called it then, and frankly, people really couldn't figure out what was going on in China other than it was a period of real turmoil. And I was teaching in the summer of 1971, and I had already been informed I would be joining Dr. Kissinger's staff in the fall. And on July 15th of that summer, 1971, President Nixon announced he was going to give a talk about something. We didn't know exactly what. But we all, the world, and certainly those of us who'd worked on China, were totally shocked when he announced that Henry Kissinger had already made a secret trip to China to begin the process of normalizing relations. And I immediately started getting phone calls from friends of mine in the State Department congratulating me on my good luck that I would be in the middle of this normalization process. And so, again, by kind of fluke, a risk that I had taken as a graduate student in spending 5 years learning this language and doing something that was pretty off the charts turned out to have led to some very interesting opportunities. And initially I was brought on just for 1 year on the National Security Council staff, but sort of worked out that I was making a contribution, and I indicated I was interested in staying on, and it ended up being a 5-year tour during which the relationship made significant significant progress towards normalization.
So when you left, so you were there for 5 years, so that would mean you left in 1976?
Correct.
So when you left, it wasn't for another 3 years until we actually switched our diplomatic ties
Right.
from the ROC to the PRC.
Right.
So when you left in 76, did you know that that was going to happen eventually?
No, what we knew, we anticipated it. President Nixon had told Chairman Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, the Prime Minister, that he intended to complete the full normalization of relations in his second term. But of course, because of Watergate, Mr. Nixon did not have a second term. And then I stayed on after the Nixon resignation and worked under President Ford. And the mood on both sides of the relationship at that point had deteriorated or stalled out a bit. On the Chinese side, Chairman Mao was in his last year or two. He died in 1976. And the so-called Gang of Four, a radical group around Chairman Mao's wife, had acquired much greater influence, and they were not very friendly towards the relationship. So problems began to develop there. And on the American side, President Ford didn't have the political strength to deal with the difficult choice of normalization, that is breaking ties with Taiwan. So there was a kind of hiatus. China went through its own transition in leadership, but Deng Xiaoping emerged in I guess it would be 70. He started to become active in 74, and we had dealings with him during the Kissinger period. But he really gained power by 77 and certainly 1978. And for reasons both on the Carter administration side and in terms of Deng Xiaoping, there was a desire to pick up and complete the normalization process. Both sides still shared a great concern about the Soviet Union. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan in 1978. Deng Xiaoping shared Chairman Mao's deep distrust of the Soviets, and that was shared certainly on the Carter administration side, particularly the National Security Advisor of that period, who was Zbigniew Brzezinski. So again, there was a coming together of shared interests. And so at the very end of 1979, President Carter announced that he had agreed with Deng Xiaoping to complete the normalization of relations, and that led to breaking diplomatic ties with Taiwan and establishing them with Beijing.
So working backwards just a little bit, like you stated earlier, when we began, or when the United States began the process of normalization, we have this height of the Cultural Revolution.
Right.
We have this, what appears to be this intense hatred towards the Americans coming out of China. But obviously there were things behind the scenes that we weren't maybe seeing. And so against this kind of backdrop of just tension and hatred, what are some of the factors that led to President Nixon and Dr. Kissinger and Mao being able to come together and say, let's work on the normalization of our relations?
The common and uniting theme was concerned about the Soviet Union. And you have to remember, this was not duck soup. This was not an easy initiative on either side. It was very much a personal initiative on the Chinese side of Chairman Mao and also of President Nixon. There was strong opposition within China to the opening to the U.S. Apparently there was a coup attempt by the defense minister, a man named Lin Biao, at some point in 1971. The plot was thwarted. Lin Biao got on an airplane and fled towards the Soviet Union with his wife and other family members. The plane crashed in Mongolia, apparently it ran out of gas. But that was an indication that there was real opposition. Indeed, when President Nixon had his meeting with Chairman Mao, Mao said there was a group in the country opposed to the establishing relations. On the American side, Nixon, who had, of course, a reputation for being staunchly anti-communist, had to bring along elements on, if you like, the far right of American politics who were very deeply committed to Taiwan. There was great distrust of China because of all this hostility associated with the Cultural Revolution. And so on Nixon's part, he did a very impressive job of convincing the opposition within the American political system that this was important to do for America's national interest. On the more liberal side, there was great support for normalizing relations with China. There was great fear in the country that because of the ongoing Vietnam War, the United States would get pulled into a conflict directly with China, as it had happened in the early 50s over the Korea situation. So certainly for the public, despite some concerns about the political mood in China, there was really great relief. And I'd say particularly the students who were hoping that this would end the Vietnam War, and that in the political circle, there was great relief again that it seemed that the Nixon administration would minimize the chances of being pulled into a war with China.
So moving forward to 79, when we do normalize relations,
Right.
What is the American public's view of this situation? Can you reflect a bit maybe on what, people maybe in the political realm and then also just the general public were thinking when we did officially switch those ties?
The general mood was one of fascination with China. I mean, there was very little concern about the political mood. People were just crawling all over themselves to get into China, to have an opportunity to visit the country. And the Chinese played on that very effectively. They, of course, China has a great and ancient culture. The Forbidden City and the cultural relics that were unearthed during the communist period, quite apart from the earlier nationalist period, were a way of projecting the great cultural aspects of Chinese history. And so a lot of the politics, except for the specialists, really weren't paid attention to. So there was a period there of a few years after the Kissinger secret trip of people bragging about, gee, I got into China before you did. And there was a period where people are, I would say, a little bit gaga about getting into China. That was all very supportive of the Nixon initiative. And you may remember the so-called ping-pong diplomacy period when before the Kissinger secret trip, Zhou Enlai had invited the American ping-pong team to visit. That produced a great upwelling of interest. And then the Chinese team came on a reciprocal visit in April of '72 after President Nixon's visit in February. And again, there was just enormous interest in ping pong and what it had to say about this very esoteric and, to that point, mysterious or distant country. I mean, those were the days before we had the kind of television and internet and all the things that give us direct access to the country, much less the deep economic and other relations, student exchanges that are just normal today. So China was a mysterious and very appealing country.
That's really interesting because now I think for the general public today, that ancient, mysteriousness is still definitely an element of it. But I think, unfortunately, now so much of what the general public focuses on is so many negative things: pollution, human rights, authoritative system,
Right.
all those things. So that's very interesting to me that coming off of, the Vietnam War, we're still in the middle of the Cold War, but still there's just this idea, it's just curious. It's not a bad thing, it's just a mysterious thing.
Well, how do we know China? We knew China mostly through their cuisine, through Chinese restaurants.
Ping pong.
And there was this just popular notion, if you dug a hole through the middle of the earth, China would be on the other side, right, of the world. It was that sense of a very distant, a distant culture that was unique. And again, people were, in those early years, just very excited to be engaged and have the opportunity to visit.
So after you left the NSC in 1976, you moved out to California and you joined RAND as the head of their political science department. 10 years later, however, you rejoined public service in '86 when you joined the State Department as the director of policy planning. So upon your return into the government, did you notice any changes in the way that the U.S. interacted with China, or how had the U.S. China relationship evolved during this period?
Well, the key to answering your question is that, again, at the turn of the year 1979-80, diplomatic relations had been established. And that was very important to Deng Xiaoping's policies because normal relations with the United States facilitated the economic takeoff of China. Now, there were still areas of tension, particularly the issue of our residual relations with Taiwan. And in 1982, there was a negotiation that established a framework for the U.S. maintaining relations with Taiwan, and the idea was that over time, the arms sales issue would be gradually resolved. That has drifted along for a variety of reasons. But apart from that element of the relationship, the 1980s was a time of real takeoff in the relationship in many respects. In 1982, while at RAND, I was brought into a project that translated the Encyclopedia Britannica into Chinese. Well, that was an enormous big deal for China. It was the intellectual opening of the country. And after all the hostility of the Cultural Revolution period, to see China intellectually opening was remarkable. Student exchanges really began to take off, mostly Chinese coming to this country. My wife, Anne, was at that point working in the Carter administration, and she helped develop the scientific exchanges with China. So the 1980s, as our former ambassador Stapleton Roy has phrased it, was really a golden age, decade of tremendous positive evolution in the relationship. And tragically for both countries, that ended in 1979 with the Tannenbaum, the June 4th incident. But up until that time, things were very positive. I worked, as you noted, for Secretary of State George Shultz. And I remember in August of 1988, we made what was the last official trip of that sort before Tiananmen. And I recall we had a meeting with the Communist Party chief, Zhao Ziyang. And Zhao Ziyang told Secretary Shultz that they were proceeding for economic reforms on a broad basis. They were even thinking of a convertible currency, which was a big deal at the time. So up until the Tannenbaum Incident, the 1980s was a very productive, positive time in the relationship.
So speaking to the Tiananmen Incident, at this time, you are now Secretary of State for East Asian and Public Affairs.
Pacific Affairs.
Pacific Affairs, I'm sorry.
Right.
And that is a position that has been appointed to you by President Bush.
Correct.
And from my understanding of, George H.W. Bush, he had lived in China, he loved China, he felt like he had a special relationship, with China. And so to me, the way I look at it, the Tiananmen incident has got to be a very heartbreaking situation for him and for the State Department and, I mean, for America in general. Can you reflect a little bit on what it was like and the decisions that you had to make really quickly after that incident occurred?
Well, you've got to begin with the fact that President Bush in the early 1970s had been the head of the so-called liaison office in Beijing. This was the period before normalization.
Right.
And during that time, Mr. Bush, liaison office chief Bush, got to know many of the Chinese leaders. He used to bicycle around the country, and so he really had a good feel for the China situation and knew personally the leadership. How did that affect reaction to the Tiananmen situation? On the one hand, after the shooting incidents that killed a number of students, the numbers are still debated, but it was clearly an event that was above all deeply wounding to the Chinese. The leadership split. Zhao Ziyang, who had been a reformist and who sympathized with the student demonstrations, was removed from power, and hardliners, supported by Deng Xiaoping, a man named Li Peng in particular, took over the leadership. And the question was, how would China deal with this situation internally, and how would the world react? Well, after the incident, there was enormous public pressure, not only in the United States, but around the world against the violent repression of the student demonstrators. And economic sanctions were imposed on China by many countries, the U.S. included. And President Bush then was very concerned about the breakdown in the relationship. And so to try to keep the situation somewhat stable, he secretly sent his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, and the number two person in the State Department, Lawrence Eagleburger, to China secretly for talks with Deng Xiaoping, and tried to find a way to stabilize the relationship. When it became public that the secret trip had occurred, produced a public uproar. People thought we shouldn't deal with what later were referred to as the butchers of Beijing. And in terms of the U.S. government's handling of the situation, as my boss at the time, Secretary of State James Baker, used to say, that the China desk officer in the U.S. government for managing this relationship was none other than the President of the United States, because President Bush had had this personal set of relationships and was deeply concerned with preventing a further deterioration in the relationship. So as Assistant Secretary, I thought for a while that I wouldn't have too much to do with China because China had become a kind of pariah. But as it turned out, a negotiation to deal with the Indochina situation, initiated initially by the French and the Indonesians, led to a UN Security Council negotiation trying to resolve the conflict in Cambodia. So ironically, even though I wasn't dealing with the Chinese directly, through the UN Security Council, I was working very closely with them on this negotiation over the Cambodia situation. And that turned out to be a productive collaboration until Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August of 1991. I happened to be working with Secretary Baker at that time, and we were in Mongolia. We had normalized relations with Mongolia, and the word came on August 1st that Saddam had invaded Kuwait. So suddenly there was a need to upgrade our relations with China, And I was dispatched to Beijing from Mongolia. I actually had to fly to Moscow and then on back to Mongolia because President Bush was in Moscow. We were sorting out our policy. But the appeal I made in Beijing was for Chinese support in the Security Council for resolutions and action against Saddam Hussein. And we got Chinese support, and that helped to put the China relationship somewhat on a better track because it was evident we still had shared national security concerns.
So if we fast forward to kind of where we are today with China, we often hear the U.S. China relationship described as one of mutual mistrust or mutual distrust.
Right.
Where do you see the seeds of this distrust? Is this after the Tiananmen Incident? Is this before with the issue of Taiwan?
Well, the Taiwan issue certainly has been and remains something of an area of concern. But Chairman Mao told President Nixon and Kissinger in 1972 and 3 that the Taiwan issue was a secondary issue, that it should be resolved in 100 years, said Mao, and they might have to fight for it then. But Mao said there were many more important issues, particularly the Soviet threat. And that general attitude was taken even by Deng Xiaoping, although he wanted to see the Taiwan issue resolved more rapidly. I would say that it was the Tiananmen incident and the global and the American reaction to it that really created deep concern in China because in effect, the world was telling, and the United States was telling the Chinese how to manage their internal political affairs. And so that situation, which has been reinforced over time by successive administrations in different ways, I think made the Chinese leadership feel that dealings with the U.S. Went over a line that they felt should not be crossed, that is, interference in their internal affairs. And I mean, I remember during the first phase of the Clinton administration, National Security Advisor Anthony Lake used to tell the Chinese that they were on the wrong side of history, they should democratize. We held off giving most favored nation trading status until China made improvements in their human rights circumstances. So despite important areas of national security, common interest, and economics, the concern about how the Chinese government, the Communist Party, managed their internal politics and these issues related to our values, human rights, rule of law, democratization, that established a real tension that persists to this day.
Well, and that's really interesting because that is definitely something that we still hear today, that, you know, China doesn't want the United States to be involved in their internal affairs.
Right.
Unfortunately, we are already out of time today, Dr. Solomon. Thank you so much. This was very interesting to hear your personal reflections. I really appreciate you joining us. And thank you to all of you at home who are joining us. We'll see you next time on China Forum.